Dear curious listener, before you drift off into sleep, let me gently ruin your faith in human decision-making. Tonight, we explore one of civilization's most confusing pastimes, getting dressed. Not for warmth, not for survival, not even to impress someone useful. No, for fashion. Strange, impractical, often dangerous fashion. So pull your blanket tight, dim the lights, and wrap yourself in something slightly less flammable than a Victorian crinoline. Because for the next few hours, we'll stroll through centuries of ruffled collars, flaming skirts, wooden shoes, and hats so large they blocked sunlight and common sense. Subscribe if you enjoy this sort of judgmental bedtime stroll, and tell me, what century are you watching from? Let's start with your feet. Look down at them, warm, padded, and gloriously functional. All 10 toes intact, we assume, perhaps tucked under a blanket, or peeking out rebelliously from the edge. Now, imagine having those feet crushed on purpose. Welcome to Tang Dynasty China. Around the 10th century, though the practice may have begun earlier, in imperial courts where luxury met lunacy. Foot binding, or lotus feet, as the euphemism goes, was one of the most bizarre and brutal beauty standards in human history. It began in childhood, of course, because grown women tend to object when you try to snap their bones. But a girl of 5 or 6, easier to convince, easier to break. The process was deceptively simple. First, the feet were soaked in a mixture of herbs and animal blood, helpful apparently for softening the spirit. Then the toenails were clipped short to avoid infections, which is ironic because infection would soon become a lifelong companion. Next came the breaking. The arch was forced upward. The toes were bent under the sole, toward the heel, and tightly wrapped with cloth, pulled tighter each day. The goal? To create a foot no longer than about 3 inches. This was called a golden lotus. Golden lotus. Because if you give a horrifying thing a poetic name, it apparently makes it more acceptable. A successful binding resulted in a curved, pointed foot, utterly useless for walking. Girls learned to tiptoe on their heels, or shuffle carefully. The pain never stopped. Some bones never healed. And that, oddly enough, was the point. You see, a woman who could not walk unaided needed to be carried, or assisted. She had to stay indoors, idle, delicate. In other words, obedient. Foot binding was less about beauty than it was about control, both social and physical. It marked a woman as elite, desirable, marriageable, especially among the upper classes. If you were poor, you needed your daughter to walk. If you were rich, you needed her not to. By the Song dynasty, it had become widespread. By the Ming, it was practically mandatory. Women with bound feet were seen as refined, disciplined, and morally upright. Their gait, that tottering, fragile shuffle, was considered seductive. A woman in pain was graceful. Centuries passed. Shoes were crafted to accommodate these deformed feet, embroidered silk slippers the size of a child's palm. Some were so small, they had to be folded and stored in lacquered boxes like jewelry. Entire industries emerged to support the aesthetic. Pain became a commodity. Meanwhile, the medical consequences were horrific. Bone infections, sepsis, paralysis. In old age, many women with bound feet found themselves unable to stand at all. And yet, even into the early 20th century, Chinese mothers were still binding their daughters' feet. Missionaries tried to intervene. Journalists published photos. Reformers spoke out. But culture, as always, moved slowly. Some families believed unbound feet would doom their daughters to loneliness. Others believed the tradition was sacred proof of refinement. And some simply couldn't imagine a life without it. It wasn't until 1912, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, that foot binding was officially banned. But the ban came with asterisks and compromises. You weren't allowed to start binding your daughter's feet anymore. But if they were already bound, you could finish. Progress, in the loosest sense. The last shoe factories for lotus feet didn't close until the 1990s. And as recently as the early 2000s, elderly women, now in their 90s, could still be found in Chinese villages, feet deformed and wrapped in gauze, living relics of a quiet brutality passed down as love. So tonight, as you stretch your toes or wiggle them freely beneath the sheets, take a moment to appreciate the unremarkable miracle of mobility. You are not being judged for the length of your foot. You are not expected to walk like a wounded bird to impress a suitor. You are not an accessory to your own oppression. You are simply barefoot. And in the long, strange history of fashion, that alone is revolutionary. Let's move on to your face for a moment. You've probably spent some time whitening your teeth, brushing, rinsing, maybe even dabbing them with overpriced strips that promise a radiant smile. But if you had been born in Japan any time between the 4th and 19th centuries, that smile of yours would be considered distressingly immature. Because in traditional Japanese beauty culture, white teeth weren't elegant. They were childish, and frankly, a little uncivilized. Which is why, for over 1,000 years, women, and sometimes men, stained their teeth black. Permanently. The practice was called ohaguro, a term that literally means blackening the teeth. And yes, it looked exactly like it sounds. A full-mouth ink-black grin, glistening and ghostly. The earliest records date back to the Kofun period, but it became popular among aristocratic women during the Heian era. Later, it spread to the samurai class, geisha, imperial court, and eventually even to common folk. Why? For beauty, for status, for hygiene, and, because the world is endlessly contradictory, for modesty. You see, black teeth were seen as mature and restrained, a sign of refinement, unlike bright white teeth, which were associated with animals, predators in particular. Showing your white teeth was considered feral, so to appear dignified, you dulled your sparkle. Women would typically begin the blackening process after marriage or after reaching adulthood. And once you committed, you committed. The solution was a mixture of iron filings, vinegar, tea, and sometimes gallnut tannin. It smelled as appetizing as it sounds. The iron would oxidize and coat the enamel in a thin, tar-like film. But here's the plot twist. It actually protected their teeth. Ohaguro formed a seal that prevented tooth decay long before anyone knew what a cavity was. It kept the teeth strong and uninfected. Essentially, it was the first anti-cavity dental treatment, centuries before fluoride. So yes, it looked terrifying. But medically speaking, surprisingly ahead of its time. You had to reapply it often, sometimes daily, which meant keeping a little pot of blacking solution nearby, like a medieval lip gloss. And because we can't have nice things, it also became a tool of social control. In some eras, laws were passed stating exactly who was allowed to blacken their teeth. Samurai wives? Yes. Merchant class girls? Sometimes. Street performers? Not likely. Just like silk, swords, and surnames, black teeth became a marker of class. Geisha wore it with elegance. Court ladies wore it with obligation. And the rules shifted constantly with fashion and empire. The more refined the court, the blacker the teeth. But of course, all beauty trends must die, often at the hands of modernization. When Japan opened its borders to Western influence during the Meiji Restoration, everything changed. White teeth were suddenly modern. Black teeth were called barbaric. And just like that, over 1,000 years of tradition was scrubbed out with imported toothpaste. The practice was officially banned for government employees in the late 1800s. It lingered in some geisha districts for a while longer, but by the 20th century it had mostly vanished. Except in a few surviving photographs, where the black mouths still glimmer beneath powdered faces, calm, composed, quietly elegant. Now imagine showing up to a modern job interview with a full set of ink black teeth. Would they call you stylish, traditional, or just deeply concerning? That's the thing about fashion. It only looks normal when everyone around you agrees to pretend it does. So tonight, as you drift off with minty breath and enamel designed for mass market approval, spare a thought for the women who once lacquered their molars in oxidized iron to prove they were proper, poised, and proudly unattainable. In their world, your bright white teeth would be considered garish, unsophisticated, practically scandalous. So smile if you must. But know that 1,000 years ago, they would have blacked that smile right out of your face. You're walking through the desert. The sun is merciless. The air tastes like sand. You're sweating through your linen tunic, the only fabric breathable enough not to kill you. And on your head is a cone of scented wax. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where being fashionable meant placing a slowly melting candle on your scalp and pretending everything was perfectly normal. These were called perfume cones, and they weren't some rare ritual object. They show up constantly in Egyptian art, balanced delicately atop wigs, heads, and headdresses. The exact details are debated. Did people wear them daily or just for special events? Were they real or symbolic? But the general idea remains the same. Take a lump of solidified animal fat or beeswax, infuse it with expensive resins and oils like myrrh or frankincense, and then plop it on your head like a fashionable fondue. Over time, and under the Egyptian sun, it would melt, slowly, deliberately, releasing fragrance as it trickled down your wig and neck and, possibly, into your eyes. Because nothing says refinement like being gently basted in aromatherapy while attending a banquet. You might ask, why? Well, ancient Egypt was obsessed with scent. Pleasant smells were linked to status, purity, and closeness to the gods. The elite didn't just want to smell nice, they wanted to smell divine. And in a world without deodorant, Febreze, or indoor plumbing, that was no small task. The cone, in theory, gave off a pleasant perfume for hours, which was helpful when your formal wear involved several layers of linen, a full face of cosmetics, and possibly the skull of a dead cat somewhere in the house shrine. The cones were also a statement. Look how rich I am. I can afford to ruin a perfectly good wig with imported frankincense. Now, speaking of the face, we need to talk about eyeliner, because no culture on earth took eyeliner more seriously than the Egyptians. The stuff was called kohl, a dark powder made from crushed minerals like galena or stibnite, mixed with animal fat or oil, and carefully applied with a tiny stick. It lined both the upper and lower eyelids, creating that now iconic almond shape. Not for vanity. Well, not just for vanity. Kohl was believed to have spiritual and medicinal powers. It was meant to protect you from the glare of the sun, ward off disease, and, most importantly, repel the evil eye. And when I say everyone wore it, I mean everyone. Men, women, children, pharaohs, priests, peasants, even statues of gods were painted with eyeliner, just in case divine omnipotence wasn't enough protection from eye strain. The darker and thicker, the better. Modern archaeologists have found coal containers carved from ivory and alabaster, tucked into tombs like sacred heirlooms. And yes, some of the compounds they used did, in fact, have mild antibacterial properties. So once again, ancient fashion turns out to be part vanity, part science, part religious insurance policy. Just imagine getting dressed for an ancient dinner party. You've oiled your body with unguents. You've shaved your head. Everyone shaved their heads. And donned your best ceremonial wig. You've painted your eyes black, applied a bit of red ochre to your cheeks. And now you're placing a fragrant cone of melting wax on top of it all, hoping it doesn't drip into your soup. And you thought your skincare routine was excessive. The thing is, the Egyptians weren't playing dress-up. Their appearance was a sacred contract between themselves, the gods, and society. Cleanliness was godliness. Scent was power. Style was spiritual. And discomfort, entirely beside the point. So tonight, if you feel a little overdressed in your cotton pajama pants and mismatched socks, just remember, at least your forehead isn't slowly marinating in scented animal fat. You're not coating your eyelids in crushed lead ore. You are, by every ancient metric, tragically underdressed, but also blissfully safe. Sleep well, little pharaoh. Picture this. You're standing in the palace at Knossos, around 2000 BCE. The walls are painted with dolphins. The columns are red. The air smells like crushed olives and incense. And your waist is being squeezed like a ripe fig in a silk ribbon. Welcome to the world of Minoan fashion. The Minoans, based on the island of Crete, were one of the earliest advanced civilizations in Europe. They gave us beautiful frescoes, linear A script we still can't read, and possibly the first corset. Yes, you heard that right. Centuries before Victorian fainting couches, Minoan women were already lacing themselves into tightly fitted belts and bodices, cinched at the waist and flaring dramatically at the hips. And in a design twist that would make modern fashion editors scream, the tops? Completely open, bare-chested, proudly, publicly. Imagine walking into brunch wearing a waist trainer and no shirt. That's the energy. These weren't hidden garments either. Minoan art, especially the famous frescoes, shows women in flounced skirts, layered aprons, wide belts, and laced bodices that somehow manage to be both sacred and deeply impractical. Their breasts weren't just visible. They were framed, pushed up, enhanced, celebrated. Because to the Minoans, this wasn't about seduction. It was about status, fertility, power. Exposed breasts in Minoan society were associated with goddesses, priestesses, and elite women. They symbolized life-giving force, divine femininity, and, if we're being honest, a certain amount of fashion courage. You were supposed to look like a goddess, a well-dressed, extremely snatched, slightly breathless goddess. Now, the corset part. It wasn't made of boning and satin. This was more of a tightly bound belt or girdle, likely made of leather or heavy cloth, sometimes reinforced with metal. It pulled the waist in dramatically, emphasizing the hips and chest. You didn't wear it under your clothes. It was the clothes. And while we don't know the exact logistics, we assume the usual: squeezing organs, reducing lung capacity, and praying you don't need to bend over. It's hard to say exactly how widespread this trend was. Most of what we know comes from palace frescoes, so we're likely seeing the high-status version of Minoan dress. But what a version it is. vivid dyes, layered skirts, gold accessories, and a level of confidence we don't usually associate with the Bronze Age. What makes Minoan fashion especially strange, and strangely modern, is the way it blends functionality and fantasy. The skirts were likely light and breathable, useful for Crete's hot climate. But the belts? That's where things got symbolic. Narrowing the waist into an exaggerated hourglass shape wasn't just aesthetically pleasing. It was a way of broadcasting refinement, self-control, and spiritual alignment with the great mother goddesses. In other words, if your spleen wasn't being gently massaged by leather binding, were you even devout? The style persisted for centuries, evolving into increasingly elaborate silhouettes. Some historians think it was part of ritual dress. Others believe it reflected changing ideas about femininity, performance, and divine beauty. And then, like most civilizations with interesting fashion sense, the Minoans disappeared, possibly due to a volcanic eruption, possibly due to invasions. But their corset lived on, in memory, in myth, in high school textbooks, and eventually in Paris fashion shows and Pinterest boards that claimed nothing is new. So tonight, if you're lying there in your loose pajama bottoms, comfortably bloated from snacks, breathing freely with both lungs, just know, 4,000 years ago, a Cretan priestess was twirling in a three-tiered skirt, her waist crushed into perfection, her chest proudly unsupervised, and she still managed to look holier than you ever will. History, as always, is not here to flatter you. But it might teach you this: divine femininity. Apparently, it requires excellent posture. Imagine waking up tomorrow and being legally required to wear a bed sheet. Not over your shoulder, mind you. No, you have to fold it just so, drape it at a precise angle, and walk like a philosophical snail, careful not to trip over the part dragging in the dust. Welcome to ancient Rome, the land of roads, aqueducts, bad emperors, and deeply judgmental fashion codes. At the center of it all, the toga. Now, if you're picturing a college frat party, you're already doing it wrong. Roman togas were not simple, not comfortable, and certainly not optional. They were enormous, unwieldy, status-laden garments made of heavy wool, wrapped around the body in a way that required both practice and probably a bit of existential despair. You couldn't just throw one on and be done with it. No. It had to be folded and pleated with geometric precision. Some versions required over 18 feet of fabric. Try wrapping your entire dignity in a picnic blanket, and you'll get close. But here's the catch. Not everyone could wear one. In fact, almost no one could. The toga was reserved for male Roman citizens only, a very specific, exclusive group. Foreigners, enslaved people, women, off limits. Well, except for one specific group of women, prostitutes. Yes, in one of history's more spectacular acts of moral contradiction, the Roman state not only banned women from wearing togas, it then forced certain women to wear them as a mark of shame. Specifically, women who were considered infames, a legal category for sex workers, actors, and other scandalously visible individuals, were required to wear the toga instead of the traditional female stola. It was a form of sartorial punishment, a visual scarlet letter. In the Roman moral imagination, the stola symbolized virtue, modesty, and domestic respectability. The toga? That was for citizens and courtesans, and never both at once. So a woman forced to wear a toga had her sexuality literally written in wool. It wasn't just fashion, it was law. And you thought business casual was oppressive, Different colors and styles of toga marked different ranks and roles. The toga virilis, plain white, meant you were a grown-up male citizen. The toga praetexta, with a purple stripe, was worn by magistrates and noble children. Then there was the toga candida, so dazzlingly bleached that it gave us the word candidate, because that's what you wore to beg for political office. Imagine running for public office today in a blinding white wool burrito. Honestly, might improve turnout. The toga pulla was dark, worn during mourning, which, if you've ever worn one in summer, probably applied every day. Because here's the final absurdity. Togas were hot. They were itchy. They absorbed everything: sweat, dust, political anxiety. There were no pins or fasteners. You had to keep adjusting it with one arm while pretending to be dignified with the other. And yet, this unwieldy, impractical garment became the symbol of Roman civilization, the uniform of senators, poets, emperors, and people pretending to be all three. When Cicero gave a speech, it was in a toga. When Julius Caesar was stabbed, famously, he was wearing a toga. It was drenched in blood and symbolism. The toga was Rome, which is to say, complicated, contradictory, self-important, and constantly tripping over itself. So tonight, as you lie in your stretchy modern fabrics, unrestricted by class laws or hemline hierarchies, take a moment to appreciate how very few things are required of you. No one has legislated your outfit. No one has assigned you a social category based on your lapel. And, best of all, no one is wrapping you in 18 feet of state-sponsored wool just to let the world know how Roman you are. Sleep well, toga dropout. Let's move now to ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, theater, philosophy, and extremely hazardous wardrobe fasteners. You've probably imagined the look before: flowing linen robes, sandals, a warm Mediterranean breeze, olive trees swaying gently in the background. Tranquil, effortless, classical. Except, of course, for the part where your clothing was held together with giant bronze pins positioned just inches from your throat. Because why sew a sleeve when you could arm yourself with something vaguely weaponized? Meet the fibula, a long metal pin used to fasten the chiton or peplos, the two most common garments of the time. The chiton was a sort of linen tunic, long, loose, and rectangular. The peplos, worn mostly by women, was similar, but often folded at the top and belted at the waist. Neither one came pre-assembled. You'd take a big rectangle of fabric, drape it around yourself, and then use these enormous pins, sometimes up to 8 inches long, to hold it in place at the shoulders. And yes, that means that your outfit was secured using something that resembled a decorative spike, right near your clavicle. What could possibly go wrong? Well, historians don't have exact numbers, but let's just say there were incidents. One Greek myth even describes a group of enraged women killing a man by stabbing him to death with their peplos pins. Now, whether that story is literal, symbolic, or just an ancient version of "don't mess with us," the message is clear. Ancient Greek fashion could be lethal. Of course, that wasn't the intention. The pins were meant to show elegance, not serve as emergency weaponry. Bronze was expensive. Silver and gold were better. These pins weren't just functional, they were ornamental, a mark of status. The longer and shinier, the more refined you were. So naturally, they were placed where everyone could see them. Your shoulders, your chest, sometimes even across your upper arms like a casual threat. And because they were visible, they had to be dramatic. Fashion in ancient Greece was, ironically, all about subtlety, drapery, folds, balance. But the fasteners, that's where you flexed. Which leads us to one of the stranger truths of ancient dress. The Greeks didn't really sew their garments. Clothing was largely uncut and unstitched. It was shaped by how it was folded, pinned, or belted. And yes, that meant that half your outfit could fall off if you sneezed too hard. So if you were imagining toga parties and carefree strolling, revise the mental image. You're carefully positioning a deadly brooch above your vital arteries and hoping your toddler doesn't grab it mid-tantrum. But dignity must be maintained. Clothing, after all, was deeply tied to status and morality. The way you wore your chiton, how high the hem, how cinched the waist, how precise the folds, signaled whether you were modest, noble, and deserving of respect. And like everything else in ancient society, it was different depending on your gender. Women's garments were generally longer, more layered, more restricted, sometimes pinned shut completely along the arm to create makeshift sleeves. Men's were shorter, sometimes exposing one shoulder or a muscular leg, for all your heroic grocery lifting needs. Children wore simpler tunics, slaves, often just a basic wrap. Philosophers, whatever smelled most of ethics and olives. And if you were a warrior, you might still wear a pinned chiton under your armor. Because when you're headed into battle, why not accessorize with some light impalement risk? So tonight, as you lie under a duvet that doesn't stab you, in clothing that didn't require metal hardware to stay on, spare a moment of gratitude for modern seamstresses. You're not wrapped in a single piece of uncut cloth. You didn't have to jab a decorative spike through your shoulder just to look respectable. You're safe, you're warm, and you're wearing something, however plain, that won't accidentally puncture a lung. Now, take a look at your feet. Again, they're probably doing something practical right now, tucked beneath a blanket, maybe wearing socks with questionable elasticity, maybe one leg sticking out to regulate your medieval temperature. Whatever the case, your toes are where they should be. But if you had been alive in the late Middle Ages, particularly the 14th or 15th century, your toes would have been somewhere else entirely. Specifically, about 20 inches ahead of you. Welcome to the glorious age of poulaines, or Krakow shoes, the European footwear trend that boldly asked, "What if my shoes arrived before I did?" These were long, pointed shoes that curled, stretched, and sometimes flopped several inches, or feet, in front of the actual human foot. At their peak of absurdity, the tips had to be tied to the wearer's knees with chains or ribbons, just so they could walk without tripping. And yes, this was deliberate. Because in medieval Europe, fashion wasn't just vanity. It was warfare. Not physical warfare, mind you. Class warfare. The longer your poulaines, the higher your status. If you were poor or practical, your shoes ended where your foot did. But if you were noble, aristocratic, ridiculously wealthy, your shoes extended halfway across the room. And with every step you reminded the peasants, "I am so rich, I can afford to fall downstairs." Poulain likely originated in Poland, hence the name Krakow shoes. They caught on in England, France, and beyond, eventually dominating elite fashion. The basic shoe was leather, slim, curved, occasionally reinforced with whalebone or moss stuffing to maintain the dramatic point. Some had bells on the ends. Others had curled tips like elf shoes. The effect was halfway between aristocrat and clown. But make no mistake, this was serious fashion. The absurdity was the point. The very impracticality signaled your superiority. You couldn't run in these. You could barely walk in them, which is exactly what made them desirable. These were shoes for standing, for posing, for being seen. Poulains weren't just long, they were regulated. At one point, the English Parliament tried to ban them outright, declaring that the tips must not exceed 2 inches, which of course was roundly ignored. The church condemned them. Moralists said they were sinful. Some claimed they symbolized the devil's hooves. And yet, the fashion persisted. Because once you get nobles involved in a contest over whose shoes can most endanger public safety, there's no turning back. Even knights, literal warriors in armor, sometimes wore poulains to court. Imagine clanking down a stone hallway in full chainmail, only to be undone by your own footwear. A cautionary tale in prestige over function. And while you might think this trend died quietly in a dusty castle, echoes of it still linger. Just look at runway fashion, or influencer shoes, or stilettos engineered by people who've clearly never worn shoes. We still glorify impracticality, just with better arch support. But back in the 1400s, a long shoe wasn't just about style. It was about identity. It told the world, I don't labor. I don't walk far. I don't need balance. I have money. So tonight, as you stretch out your feet, fully contained, sensibly shaped, and feel the sweet flatness of a modern soul, take a moment to thank the anonymous medieval shoemaker who whispered, "What if elegance, but dangerous?" You are not wearing 20 inches of leather nonsense. You are not shackled to your kneecaps just to make an entrance. You are warm, you are stable, and you are gloriously free from the burden of performative podiatry. You wake up in a castle. The air is chilly. Your dress weighs as much as a small child. Breakfast is a distant concept, and your hat is 3 feet tall, balanced delicately on your scalp, like a conical monument to wealth, restraint, and upper-class vertigo. Congratulations. You're a noble woman in 14th century Europe, and your social status has been gently fastened to your skull with wire, linen, and hope. What you're wearing is called a hennin, the original hat that enters the room before you do. Think tall, pointed cone. Think flowing veil. Think fairy tale princess, but with gout. The hennin emerged in Burgundy in the late Middle Ages and quickly became the it girl accessory among aristocratic women in France, Flanders, and beyond. You didn't just wear one, you announced one. A hennin could rise over 30 inches above your head. It was often wired internally to keep its shape. The exterior was fabric, velvet, silk, or fine wool, and the tip was typically crowned with a transparent veil, trailing behind you like a wedding gown that gave up halfway. Why so tall? Because the higher the hat, the higher the rank. Literally. Height wasn't just for visibility. It was a visible hierarchy. Your headgear said what your family name didn't have to. If a peasant's hat was practical, the hennin was performance art. It told the world, I do not lift heavy objects. I do not run. I definitely do not chase children or stir porridge. This is not a wizard hat. It's dignity. Of course, not all hennins were conical. Some were truncated, flat at the top, like someone got tired mid-design. Others tilted dramatically, perched like architectural accidents. And before the hennin fully took over, there was the coif, a close-fitting linen cap worn underneath or alone. The coif was more modest, more hygienic, and more popular across classes. Women of all ranks wore coifs for warmth, cleanliness, and decorum. They kept hair tucked away, protected from lice, soot, and the creeping existential crisis that was medieval life. But if the coif was function, the hennin was pure flair. It often required assistance to put on. You couldn't ride a horse in one without becoming a local legend, and God help you if there was wind. There were even complaints, yes, complaints, from male clerics and writers who found the hennin indecent, absurd, and proof of woman's inherent vanity, which, to be clear, is how you know it was working. Some cities tried to regulate the size of these hats. In 1428, the city of Florence reportedly banned hennins above a certain height, fearing that women would bankrupt their families trying to outcone one another, because nothing terrifies a medieval official like a fashionable woman with balance and budget. There was also the matter of entering doorways. You had to tilt, gently, gracefully, like a swan wearing a traffic cone. And don't even think about bowing. You'd impale someone. But style, as ever, is pain. And medieval noblewomen wore that pain with posture. You were expected to carry yourself with elegance, with restraint, with the slow, measured steps of someone who knows one wrong gust could send their dignity sailing into the moat. And as absurd as it sounds today, the hennin worked. It made the wearer look tall, ethereal, untouchable. It elongated the neck, framed the face. It said, I am above all this, including physics. So tonight, as your head sinks comfortably into a pillow, free of structure, scaffolding, and social pressure, take a moment to honor the women who once slept upright just to preserve the crease in their veil. You're not bound by silk cones. You're not negotiating gravity with every hallway. You are horizontal, hatless, and mercifully unconcerned with the politics of vertical fabric. Let's say just for a moment that you're a fashionable man in 16th century Europe. You've got your velvet doublet, your hose, tight-fitting, of course, your cloak, dramatically draped. But there's one more item you absolutely cannot forget. The accessory, front and center, loud, proud, heavily stitched. That's right. Tonight we talk about the codpiece. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely this was just an unfortunate design decision? Oh no, this was intentional. Let's start at the beginning. In the 1400s, men's legwear began evolving into something tight, form-fitting, and, unfortunately, divided. Hose were made in two separate pieces, one for each leg, tied to a doublet, which meant a gap, right in the middle. And sure, you could ignore the gap, wear a tunic long enough to cover it, and move on with your life. But this was the Renaissance, and modesty had a PR problem. So instead, tailors invented a solution, the codpiece. A triangular flap, laced or buttoned over the opening, originally meant to cover the area discreetly. Practical, sensible, no big deal. But as time went on, as with most fashion, the codpiece got ambitious. By the 1500s, it had grown larger, sturdier, more decorative. And no, it was not subtle. It was padded, quilted, bejeweled, embroidered with gold thread and family crests. It had tassels, buttons, tiny pouches, and at its most flamboyant, it became an actual sculpted bulge, meant not just to cover anatomy, but to announce it. This was no longer about modesty. This was marketing. In case you're wondering, yes, people noticed. In portraits, codpieces are positioned proudly, often gleaming at the center of otherwise serious compositions. Look at a painting of Henry VIII. The man is wearing 10 layers of royal fur. But your eyes? They go directly to the fortified triangle of ambition stitched onto his pelvis. That was the point. Codpieces symbolized virility, strength, wealth, the usual Renaissance cocktail of masculine insecurity disguised as power. Some were even functional. A few codpieces acted as small purses, perfect for storing coins, handkerchiefs, and presumably crushed dreams. Because nothing says refined nobleman like reaching into your pants for loose change. Others were purely for show, larger, stiffer, comically inflated. And yes, this eventually led to criticism. Satirists mocked them. Clergy condemned them. Foreigners rolled their eyes. One German visitor in 1580 described English gentlemen as wearing monstrous codpieces bigger than their heads, which honestly sounds more like a traffic hazard than a fashion choice. By the early 1600s, the codpiece began to disappear, quietly. Tastes changed, waistlines rose, cloaks grew longer, and the padded pouch of ego gently faded from the stage. But it never really died. It lingered. In armor, in theater, in glam rock. Every time someone designs pants with extra attention in the front, the codpiece winks from the shadows. So tonight, as you drift off, wearing nothing more dramatic than an elastic waistband, feel free to exhale with gratitude. You're not stitching symbols of power onto your groin. You're not polishing decorative buttons over your reproductive PR campaign. And no one expects you to tuck loose coins into a velvet pouch below your belt. You are free, comfortable, hidden, and, most importantly, you are no longer living in a world where fashion needed to be physically aimed at the viewer. Picture this. You've left behind all worldly pleasures, feasting, drinking, money, ambition, even your cousin's poorly tuned lute. You've taken vows. You've joined a monastery. You've committed your soul to God. And now, you must express this spiritual devotion by having someone shave a large, round, bald patch into the crown of your head. Because apparently, heaven has a very particular aesthetic. This was called tonsure, a ritual haircut used by monks and clergy to symbolize religious humility, separation from vanity, and total submission to the divine. Nothing said, "I renounce the world," like looking like a human bagel. And it wasn't just symbolic. It was mandatory. By the Middle Ages, tonsure was the standard haircut for Western monks, particularly those in the Catholic tradition. The practice may have begun earlier in late antiquity, but by the time we hit the 9th century, it was everywhere, a visual badge of holiness. The most famous version? The Roman tonsure, a large, bald circle on the crown of the head, with a ring of hair left like a halo of obligation, or, if you prefer, the spiritual satellite dish. Other variations existed. The Celtic tonsure shaved the front of the head from ear to ear. The Eastern Orthodox traditions generally avoided shaving the crown entirely, opting instead for short-cropped hair or beard-related austerity. But in Latin Christendom, that donut of doom was standard, and yes, it had to be maintained. This wasn't a one-time event. Monks had to keep it tidy, regularly shaved, even, symmetrical. Nothing says inner peace like scheduling your next spiritual buzz cut. Why, you ask? Did this ever become the standard? Because hair, in many ancient traditions, was associated with vanity, lust, and pride. Shaving the head symbolized renouncing those impulses, removing individual identity, submitting to a greater, invisible order. Also, making sure everyone in the chapel could immediately spot who wasn't supposed to have fun. The robe, too, completed the look. Monastic garments were plain, usually wool, usually earth-toned. The goal was modesty, utility, and a firm commitment to never being mistaken for someone having a good time. You wore the same robe every day. You slept in it, worked in it, prayed in it, and if you were very lucky, washed it. Occasionally. The most common monastic garment was the habit, usually a tunic or cloak with a hood tied with a simple cord belt, no buttons, no silk, no flare. The only accessory? The blank expression of someone who'd just taken a vow of silence and is mentally composing sermons about soup. To outsiders, the tonsure looked absurd. Foreign visitors often wrote about it with a mix of horror and bafflement. Some heretical groups mocked it outright. Protestants later abandoned it entirely, calling it papist superstition, which, to be fair, is how most people react to bald circles they didn't sign up for. Even within the church, there were debates. One medieval council spent considerable time arguing about which type of tonsure was more correct, not more useful, not more meaningful, more aligned with doctrine, because nothing brings monks together like fighting over which haircut best pleases God. Eventually, the practice faded. By the 17th and 18th centuries, many orders relaxed the rules. The Catholic Church officially abolished the requirement for tonsure in 1972, which means, for the first time in centuries, men of the cloth could look in the mirror and not see a medieval pastry. But the symbolism lingers. You can still see it in paintings, statues, costume dramas that go all in on accuracy. The smooth dome of spiritual surrender, the woolen robe of functional suffering. Together they tell a story, not just of faith, but of fashion designed specifically to suppress identity. So tonight, as you lie there in your soft hoodie or pill-stained t-shirt, hair disheveled and soul unregulated, breathe deeply. You're not bound by vows. No one's coming to shave your crown in the name of humility. And God, should he be watching, is probably just fine with your current neckline. Imagine preparing for an elegant evening. You've bathed, you've dressed, you've accepted the crushing inevitability of social interaction, and now you reach for your final accessory. Not a necklace, not a scarf, a giant frilly disc, starched into submission, wired for maximum volume, and tied snugly around your neck like a pastry wheel of poor decisions. Congratulations. You are now fashionably Elizabethan. This is the ruff, a circular, frilled collar that hovered around the neck like a halo of insecurity and laundry starch. And for about 100 years, it was the absolute height of status. Literally. The larger your ruff, the wealthier and more powerful you appeared. Some were so wide they spanned 9 inches in radius, turning the wearer's head into a sort of well-decorated sundial. And no, you couldn't turn your head. Side glances? Forbidden. Conversations? Awkward. Eating soup? A logistical nightmare. But fashion, as always, doesn't ask why. It asks how expensive and can it be ironed into submission. Ruffs began innocently enough, as simple gathers at the neckline of a shirt. But by the mid-1500s, they became detachable, more elaborate, and aggressively high maintenance. Made from fine linen or lace, ruffs were pleated into perfect concentric folds, often using heated irons and cardboard forms. Then came the starch, thick, heavy, sometimes even colored, to lock the ruff into shape. And if you're thinking, that sounds like a nightmare to maintain, you are absolutely correct. Households had servants specifically trained in the art of ruff starching. There were even professional laundresses called ruff makers, hired solely to wash, press, and shape your wearable table fan. And yes, accidents happened. One poor ruff laundress was reportedly burned to death when her linen ruffs, drying too close to the fire, caught ablaze. Because nothing says glamour like death by over-accessorizing. But what did the ruff mean? Why go through all this trouble to frame your chin in lace and misery? Simple. It was expensive. Linen wasn't cheap. Lace was often imported. Starch was high grade. And the labor to maintain it? Considerable. A giant ruff told the world you didn't work with your hands, didn't eat in a hurry, and didn't need to turn your head without warning. It was elegance, exaggerated. Nobles wore them. Courtiers wore them. Even Queen Elizabeth Lorne wore enormous ruffs, making it impossible to determine where she ended and where her dry cleaning bill began. Some ruffs were even wired, with hidden support frames beneath the folds, like scaffolding for your neck. Others were dyed pale pinks or soft yellows. A few were black for maximum theatricality. And the biggest, most aggressive ruffs were starched so stiff they could probably double as a weapon. But, like all over-engineered fashion statements, the ruff eventually collapsed under its own weight. By the early 1600s, it began to fade. Collars softened. Lace drifted down to the shoulders. The era of neck-based aggression came to a gentle, droopy close. Some holdouts clung to the style, of course, because nothing dies harder than a trend that took 6 hours to starch. But for most, the giant frill gave way to something marginally more wearable. A collar that let you breathe, chew, rotate. So tonight, as your neck rests comfortably on a pillow, free of wire, starch, and spiraling linen spirals of doom, take a moment to appreciate the quiet mercy of modern design. No one expects you to iron your collar into a satellite dish. No one will judge you for not being flammable at the neck. And your head is allowed to turn. Imagine getting dressed in the morning. You put on your best doublet. You smooth the fabric. You admire the symmetry. Then, very deliberately, you take a dagger and slash it open. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. Because fashion, dear listener, is about making sure you look like you just barely survived a duel with flair. Welcome to Landsknecht fashion, where controlled chaos was a look and clothing was treated like a battlefield. The term slashing refers to a style in which outer garments were cut open, intentionally, to reveal the rich, colorful fabric underneath. Think puffy sleeves bulging out of jagged cuts, pant legs exploding with satin inserts, tunics shredded just enough to say, "I'm violent but coordinated." And yes, it was ridiculous on purpose. The Landsknechts were German mercenary soldiers active in the late 15th and 16th centuries. These weren't monks. These weren't scholars. These were fighters, brutal, flamboyant, and aggressively stylish. Slashing may have started on the battlefield, where torn clothing revealed hastily added layers, but it very quickly became an aesthetic choice. The more elaborate the slashing, the more daring the statement. And of course, the more expensive the fabric beneath, the more impressive you appeared. It was a walking contradiction. Clothes that looked like they'd been destroyed, but cost a fortune. And make no mistake, this wasn't some fringe trend. By the early 1500s, slashing had made its way into upper-class fashion. Nobles were doing it, even royalty. At one point, King Francis I of France reportedly had entire suits slashed to show off silk linings in contrasting colors. Because nothing says divine right to rule like dressing as if your tailor had a nervous breakdown. And the cuts weren't just on sleeves. They appeared across chests, thighs, shoulders, even hats. Some garments were so riddled with slashes they resembled very expensive cheese graters. Underneath all the rips and openings, you'd find puffed-out fabric in brilliant colors. Gold, emerald, crimson. The contrast was key. The more the underlayers ballooned out, the better. You weren't dressing for comfort. You were dressing to say, "I own multiple layers of fabric. I have no regard for weather, mobility, or subtlety. I probably carry a sword and a comb. And naturally, some people tried to ruin it for everyone. Sumptuary laws, those pesky rules that dictated who could wear what, tried to curb the excess. Certain cities banned excessive slashing. Others limited how many layers you could display. Because clearly, the problem in 1525 wasn't war, famine, or plague. It was that someone's sleeves looked too dramatic. But like all good fashion rebellion, the style persisted. It was copied, softened, reimagined. Eventually, it faded into more decorative trims and less violent tailoring. Still, the spirit of slashing lives on, in ripped denim, layered streetwear, and every time someone buys jeans with distressed detailing that costs more than intact ones. So tonight, as you lie wrapped in a completely unslashed blanket, no puffed silk, no decorative gashes, give thanks. You are not wearing garments designed to look like post-battle upholstery. Your fashion does not require you to pay a tailor to cut your clothes for you. And most importantly, no one's judging your moral worth based on how many thigh holes you've got. Sleep well, you beautifully intact person. Let's say you want to impress someone. Not with your mind, not with your wealth. No, with the sheer volume of your thighs. In the 16th century, that meant one thing: padding, not shoulder pads, not gentle lining. We're talking bombast, the glamorous act of stuffing your clothing until you resembled a well-upholstered sofa. Bombast was the art of artificial bulk. People, mostly fashionable men, would have their garments filled with materials like horsehair, wool, rags, cotton, and yes, sawdust, because nothing says high status like walking around full of lumberyard scraps. This wasn't about warmth, it wasn't about comfort. It was about silhouette, big arms, big legs, big chest. Bombast made you look powerful, dominant, impressive, like a Renaissance linebacker. The more stuffed your sleeves or trunk hose, the more you projected control over your tailor, your wallet, and your physical space. A padded figure meant you didn't work. You didn't bend or run or stoop. You simply existed, like a decorative armchair in human form. This wasn't subtle either. Some doublets were so heavily stuffed they looked like armor. Others had sleeves so full they hung like sausage casings. And yes, it extended to codpieces and breeches, which were often padded to comical proportions. You weren't walking so much as bouncing slightly with each step. But hey, if your calves don't look like they're hiding spare loaves of bread, what are you even doing? The word bombast itself comes from the Latin bombax, meaning cotton. But over time, it also came to mean exaggerated speech. Because really, what is fashion if not a form of loud, padded rhetoric? This look flourished especially in Tudor England and Renaissance Europe. Think Henry VIII's court. Wide silhouettes, oversized sleeves, and layers of stuffing holding it all together like a mattress about to explode. Tailors used secret compartments to hold the stuffing in place. Some garments had slits and ties, so padding could be adjusted, in case your left arm was feeling a bit deflated that day. Of course, all of this had consequences. Bombast made garments heavier, more rigid, less breathable. Some men reportedly fainted in hot weather. Others struggled to sit. But hey, fashion hurts, especially when you're filled with horsehair and ambition. There were critics, naturally. Preachers condemned bombast as vanity. Pamphleteers mocked it as absurd. One even claimed that men were becoming so overstuffed that the tailor may as well be a butcher. And really, once your jacket needs to be trimmed and stuffed like poultry, maybe it's time to reconsider. But the trend continued for decades, expanding, deflating, shifting, until eventually slimmer silhouettes returned and everyone could breathe again. For a while. So tonight, as you lie in bed, unpadded, unstuffed, and wonderfully mobile, consider the dignity of your limbs being exactly their size. No wool in your wrists, no sawdust in your thighs, no unspoken fear that your codpiece might spring a leak mid-banquet. Just fabric and freedom. Sleep well, my naturally proportioned friend. Picture your hair, not the style, the sheer volume. Now imagine your hair is 2 feet tall. Now imagine that inside it is a miniature warship, several stuffed birds, and a ceramic urn containing the ashes of your beloved Aunt Genevieve. Congratulations, you've officially joined 18th century French nobility. This is the era of the pouf, towering hair sculptures so elaborate they required scaffolding, wire cages, and the unwavering confidence of someone with absolutely no regard for door frames. The pouf was the signature hairstyle of the late 1700s, particularly in pre-revolutionary France, when aristocrats seemed determined to stack everything they'd ever loved directly onto their scalps. And yes, these styles were real. Women, mostly women, though not exclusively, would commission personalized hair scenes to reflect their mood, politics, romance, or just hobbies. One woman reportedly wore a model of the French fleet sailing through her curls to commemorate a naval victory. Another included a bird cage, complete with a live bird. Some styles were devoted to garden themes, complete with fake flowers, miniature trees, and powdered butterflies. And yes, one very real woman famously wore a small urn in her pouf to honor a deceased relative. Because grief is temporary, style is forever. The average pouf could rise 12 to 24 inches, depending on ambition and neck strength. The structure involved padding, wire frames, false hair, pomade, and enough powder to set off asthma attacks in neighboring villages. Stylists, known as coiffeurs, used combs, irons, and long sticks to lift and shape the hair into domes, arcs, and architectural wonders. Once the structure was in place, the real fun began. Tiny porcelain figurines, glass beads, jewels, miniature windmills, fake vegetables, even tiny dioramas of entire love triangles were nestled between the curls. Some poufs told political stories, others told gossip, and most of them told your enemies, "Yes, I have more disposable income than you." These were not casual styles. A single pouf could take hours to construct, and once installed, it might not come down for days or even weeks. Women slept sitting up, with special wooden headrests to preserve the shape. Some wore protective caps made of linen and waxed paper. Others simply avoided sleep entirely. There were, of course, consequences. Hygiene was a concept. The mixture of pomade, usually made from pig fat, powder, and airlessness created a paradise for lice. Some women carried long scratching sticks disguised as fans. Others simply suffered quietly while pigeons perched over their left eyebrow. Still, the pouf persisted. Because if your hair didn't block the chandelier at dinner, what was the point? Queen Marie Antoinette famously pushed the trend to its most absurd extremes. Her styles became national news, copied, mocked, celebrated, and eventually used as a metaphor for her detachment from reality. And yet, the artistry was real. These weren't just wigs. They were theater sets. They were statement pieces. They were wearable monuments to a very specific kind of excess, the kind that inevitably collapses under its own powdered weight. By the time the French Revolution arrived, the pouf became a symbol of aristocratic arrogance. Simpler styles returned. Heads were no longer decorated with model ships. They were simply at risk of being removed. But tonight, you are not Marie Antoinette. You are not hosting a diplomatic soiree with a three-tiered pastry replica of Versailles balanced atop your skull. You are lying down. You are horizontal. Your hair may be messy. It may be thin. It may be gloriously, wonderfully boring. And no one expects it to contain wildlife. Picture this. You've been invited to court. A very important event. Nobles, diplomats, possibly a roast peacock, and naturally, you must look your best. So, you reach for the thing that screams status, refinement, and possibly lice. A wig. A towering, curled, flowered monstrosity that rests on your head like a powdered accusation. Because you, like so many 17th and 18th century elites, have embraced the glory and the tragedy of the peruke, the powdered wig. Let's begin, as so many fashion disasters do, with syphilis. In the 16th century, this particular disease was sweeping Europe like a deeply judgmental breeze. One of its many charming symptoms? Hair loss, bald patches, receding hairlines, a scalp that looked, frankly, unenthused. And in an age when appearance was everything, a visible sign of illness was not ideal. So, what's a socially anxious aristocrat to do? Cover it up, with hair that isn't yours. Early wigs began as discreet little patches. Think 1500s hair toupees. But as is tradition, modesty gave way to escalation. By the 1600s, full wigs were in vogue, especially among European nobility. And then came King Louis XIV of France, a man whose personal insecurity became a continental trend. Louis began balding young. To hide this, he commissioned an army of wig makers and began appearing in court with glorious, flowing locks that absolutely did not grow from his actual skull. Naturally, the court followed suit. Then the aristocracy. Then lawyers, judges. Soon, if you weren't wearing a wig, you might as well have shown up naked, and not just any wig. These wigs were large, curled, and increasingly powdered, with fine starch-based dust, often scented with lavender or orange blossom. The goal? To make your head smell less like death and more like potpourri. Unfortunately, the powder also made things sticky. And into that powdered forest came lice. Wigs were rarely washed. They were expensive, delicate, and sometimes made from human hair. So the little critters set up shop. Some wearers kept head scratchers, long forked sticks used to gently poke at the scalp beneath. Others simply tolerated the itch like good, suffering nobles. And the smell? Well, that depended. A well-maintained wig might smell of jasmine. A poorly kept one? Imagine flour, sweat, and disappointment. But make no mistake, wigs were a symbol. They signaled wealth, education, power. In courtrooms, the British legal system embraced wigs so hard they're still clinging to them today. Powdered affectation and all. In France, towering white wigs became synonymous with elite status, especially once women joined the game with vertical poof wigs, occasionally reaching theatrical heights. Wigs were often genderless in their symbolism. Both men and women wore them to project superiority and trend literacy. Until, of course, the French Revolution, when towering wigs began to look a bit out of touch. Suddenly, people were being executed for wearing too much lace. So maybe tone it down. Wigs shrank, colors darkened, and eventually, the powdered look faded into memory. Still, they left a mark, a cultural reminder that humanity will, at any moment in history, look a health crisis in the face and say, what if we covered it with 6 pounds of synthetic curls? So tonight, as you rest your head on a pillow, your real hair gently unbothered, your scalp delightfully unscented. Take comfort. You are not itchy. You are not powdered. You are not carrying a scented mouse nest on your skull. You are free. Sleep well, natural wonder. Imagine waking up in the 1600s. You stretch. You yawn. You mentally prepare to avoid being stabbed in a duel before breakfast. And then you put on your lace, because nothing said, "I'm a terrifying man of honor," like delicate floral embroidery dangling from your wrists and a piece of fabric slowly strangling your neck. Welcome to the golden age of the cravat, ancestor of the necktie, frilly cousin of the garrote. The cravat was a wide band of linen or lace, wrapped around the neck and tied in an artfully casual way that took half an hour and a valet with strong wrists. At first, it was a simple accessory. Croatian mercenaries wore cloth neckbands in the 30 Years' War, and French fashionistas said, "Ah yes, that's chic, but make it lace." And suddenly, men all across Europe were cinching their throats in the name of elegance. The idea was to emphasize the neck, the chin, the posture, and to show off your access to clean, expensive ironed fabric, which was rarer than you'd think. The cravat could be plain, or ruffled, or lace-edged, or made entirely of frothy white nonsense that fluttered like a pastry in a strong wind. It wasn't just decoration. It was a flex. "Look at me," it said. "I don't labor. I don't sweat. I have 3 servants whose only job is to starch this thing into a state of light aggression." And of course, the more fragile your lace, the more delicate and transparent, the more manly you were considered. Because clearly, if you're wearing fabric that could disintegrate in a light breeze, you must be powerful enough to never get dirty. That's how masculinity worked. And then, on top of all this, there were the lace sleeves. Cuffs so wide they grazed your goblet. Edges so intricate they cost more than a farmer's annual wages. You didn't roll up your sleeves. That would be peasant behavior. You delicately held them out of the way while you signed decrees, challenged enemies, or daintily dabbed wine from your lip with a monogrammed handkerchief. Naturally, there were rules. The width of your cravat, the complexity of your knot, the height at which your lace fanned out from your collar. Misstep, and you risked social ruin. Also, as a bonus, if someone tried to duel you mid-conversation, as they often did, you had to be careful not to bleed on your lace. That was embarrassing. Cravats evolved over time. They turned into stocks, those stiff neckbands of the 18th century, and eventually into the necktie, still ridiculous, but marginally less likely to cut off airflow. Lace also wandered off, from cuffs to collars, from men to women, from aristocrats to bishops. But for a while, especially in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, to be fashionable was to be laced up and barely breathing. And if you're wondering, was it comfortable? Of course not. But that wasn't the point. The point was restraint. Elegance through inconvenience. Beauty by way of borderline asphyxiation. So tonight, as you settle into your pillow, no linen looped around your trachea, no fluttering wrist ruffles catching your blanket. Take a moment to appreciate simplicity. You are unstarched. You are uncinched. You are gloriously, gloriously unfashionable by 1680s standards, and that's why you'll sleep so well. Let's say you want to enter a room, just a normal-sized parlor, nothing fancy. Unfortunately, you are wearing a skirt that is 18 feet wide, so instead of walking in, you must perform a kind of polite architectural negotiation, turning sideways, calculating your pivot radius, and trying not to knock over any aristocrats or sideboards. Welcome to the age of the crinoline, the majestic, monstrous cage that turned mid-19th century fashion into a spatial awareness test. The crinoline was a structural undergarment made of steel hoops sewn into fabric or tapes, designed to hold skirts out in a wide, bell-shaped silhouette. At its height, literally, a fashionable woman's skirt might span up to 6 feet across or more. That's roughly the size of a twin mattress, carried around your waist at all times. And yes, it was considered elegant. Crinolines first emerged in the 1850s, replacing layers upon layers of heavy petticoats. Before that, to achieve volume, women wore multiple skirts, which meant weight, heat, and the sound of constant fabric friction as you walked. Enter the cage crinoline, lighter, airier, and somehow even more dangerous. Because here's the thing, when your entire lower body is surrounded by metal hoops, you may feel powerful, but you're also one strong breeze away from disaster. And the real danger? Fire. Open hearths were common. So were candles, gas lamps, and other charmingly flammable light sources. And when your skirt takes up most of the room, you might not notice that you've wandered a little too close to the fireplace. Countless women, and this is sadly not an exaggeration, burned to death when their crinolines caught fire. The steel hoops would collapse inward as the fabric burned, trapping the wearer inside a blazing cage. A London doctor once estimated that over 3,000 crinoline-related fire deaths occurred in a single decade. Fashionable, flammable, fantastic. And if that wasn't enough, crinolines were also known for causing social chaos. Women knocked over furniture, sat on other people's laps by accident, got stuck in doorways, unable to turn around without careful choreography, were literally lifted off the ground by strong gusts of wind. There are stories of ladies walking through gardens and being toppled into fountains like overturned teacups. It wasn't just a skirt, it was a health hazard with ruffles. But it was trendy, and trend is power. Crinolines allowed women to display yards of expensive fabric. They exaggerated the waistline, emphasized posture, and created a floating, ethereal illusion, provided no one lit a match. They also allowed for secret freedom. Women beneath crinolines could walk more easily, hide belongings, or simply enjoy the privacy of a personal dome. And they were democratized fast. Mass-produced steel hoops made crinolines available to the middle class, which, of course, made the upper class very grumpy. Because if everyone can look like a walking bell tower, is it even fashionable anymore? Eventually, the crinoline was phased out in favor of bustles and slimmer silhouettes. But for a shining moment, it reigned supreme, a walking, twirling monument to beauty, absurdity, and mild personal endangerment. So tonight, as you lie under your blissfully narrow blanket, be thankful. You are not sleeping in a cage. You are not at risk of spontaneously igniting if you roll too close to a candle. And no one expects you to look elegant while managing a 6-foot radius. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be wide, but not crinoline wide. Let's take a moment to admire your silhouette, but only from behind, because in the late 1800s, that's where all the drama was. Welcome to the bustle era, the golden age of back padding, where fashion asked a simple, elegant question. What if your lower spine had a small balcony? A bustle was a padded or wired framework worn at the back of the waist to support and exaggerate the rear of a gown. It came into fashion after the decline of the crinoline, when society decided that enormous skirts were fine, but maybe only in one direction, specifically backward. The ideal bustle silhouette featured a narrow waist, a relatively flat front, and a massive cascading train puffed up like a fabric souffle behind you. The result was dramatic. Picture walking into a room. You seem respectable, demure, controlled. Then you turn around, and suddenly it's like your entire personality has been stored above your butt. Designers embraced this shift with enthusiasm. Gowns were sewn with pleats, swags, ruffles, and velvet bows piled in the back like a decorative avalanche of excess. In some cases, bustles extended so far out they formed a literal shelf, flat enough, supposedly, to rest a teacup. Were they functional? No. Were they comfortable? Also no. But were they fashionable? Deeply. In fact, the more impractical your bustle, the more elevated your social standing, because clearly you had no plans to run, sit comfortably, or move through narrow doorways. Bustles came in different shapes and levels of ambition. Some were modest pads tied around the waist. Others used metal cages, collapsible wire scaffolds that clicked and creaked as you walked, like being followed by your own portable instrument section. And of course, layers of petticoats were added on top to disguise the structure, creating the illusion of a naturally overachieving posterior. The look was everywhere: Paris, London, New York, a global statement that Victorian society had fully committed to backward elegance. But it wasn't just about appearance. The bustle communicated decorum and modesty, even as it loudly exaggerated a part of the body Victorians claimed not to discuss. It was one of fashion's great paradoxes: hide the body by making it unmissable. And then, of course, came the logistical challenges. Bustles made sitting a careful ordeal. You had to perch on the edge of chairs like an overstuffed princess. Carriages had to accommodate the extra volume. And forget about leaning back. That was for people without 20 pounds of ruffled defiance strapped to their hips. Still, for a few decades, the bustle reigned supreme. It even evolved, growing larger, then flatter, then vanishing completely as tastes changed toward the end of the 19th century. And just like that, the era of rear-centered drama quietly folded itself back into fashion history. Tonight, as you lie comfortably flat on your back, spine aligned, hips unenhanced, you may wonder what it felt like to carry your dignity in a wire cage behind you. The answer is sweaty, restricted, and probably full of crumbs. So rest easy. You are not wearing a bustle. You are not attempting to seduce a room with your lower lumbar silhouette. You are, for once, gloriously unstructured. Let's begin with a deep breath. Inhale. Hold it. Now imagine doing that, forever. Welcome to the world of the corset, one of fashion's most iconic, controversial, and enduring instruments of both beauty and bodily betrayal. A corset is a stiffened, boned garment worn to shape the torso, flattening the stomach, cinching the waist, lifting the bust, and occasionally rearranging your internal organs like furniture in a too-small apartment. Early versions date back to the 16th century, evolving from stiff bodices worn under gowns. But things got truly intense in the Victorian era, when the idea of the perfect hourglass took cultural obsession to new, breathless heights. These weren't gentle garments. They were tight-laced, often using whalebone or steel stays, and pulled so snug that you could lose inches off your waist, and maybe a bit of your dignity. Fainting couches? Not decorative. Necessary. If you can't breathe, you can't stand for long. Women were praised for having wasp waists, some shrinking down to 16 inches or less. For reference, a modern laptop is wider than that. And yet, this extreme shape was considered elegant, feminine and, of course, morally correct, because posture was often seen as a reflection of character. Standing upright and rigid, clearly a virtuous woman, slouching comfortably, might as well run off with a sailor, and so women endured. Compression of the lungs, restricted digestion, occasionally displaced organs, because of course fashion couldn't be satisfied until your liver had to ask permission to function. Medical professionals of the day warned against over-tightening, but society kept praising those narrow waists. And lest you think this was only about women, some men wore corsets too, especially dandies, actors, or politicians trying to look slim under tailored coats. Corsets were everywhere, and depending on who you ask, they were either a symbol of female repression or a symbol of female empowerment, or a weird intersection of both, padded with hypocrisy. Critics argued corsets kept women restricted, delicate, and submissive, literally binding their bodies to a rigid social role. Supporters noted that corsets gave structure, posture, even physical confidence, and that many women actively chose to wear them. There was also variation. Not all corsets were extreme. Some were loose and comfortable, meant for support rather than suffocation. Others were strictly for fashion or evening wear, and even the most severe designs were rarely laced solo. Women had agency, and many used corsetry to assert style, shape, and control over how they presented themselves. But still, it's hard to ignore the absurdity. Entire social rituals developed around corsetry. Young girls were trained into them. Dresses were sewn to accommodate the silhouette. And yes, entire conversations were shaped by whether or not you could still breathe halfway through dinner. Eventually, reform dress movements pushed back. Health corsets, less rigid stays, and ultimately the brassiere began to take over in the early 20th century. But corsets never fully disappeared. They still return in waves, in lingerie, couture, cosplay, and on red carpets, rebranded as edgy, nostalgic, or empowering. The cultural debate continues. So tonight, as you lie flat, lungs unrestricted, no steel bars pressing into your ribs, take a deep, glorious breath. You're not being cinched for courtship. You're not collapsing into a faint because someone complimented your embroidery. You are free, fashionably unconscious, and still breathing. And so we end tonight's strange parade of fashion. From crushed ribs to flammable skirts, from powdered lies to codpieces with too much ambition, humanity has never quite figured out how to get dressed without hurting itself a little. We've bound feet, blackened teeth, stuffed sleeves, padded backsides, and shaved holy bald spots into our heads, all in the name of beauty, status, virtue, or just because someone important did it first. There were hoop skirts you could hide livestock under, hats tall enough to brush the ceiling beams, wigs filled with stories, and sometimes insects, lace so delicate it collapsed if you made eye contact, and shoes that turned walking into performance art. We've flirted with fashion and fought with it. We've sewn identity into seams, stitched rank into cuffs and weaponized sleeves. And somehow, no matter the century, someone always declared, "This is elegance," even if it was itchy, or flammable, or anatomically questionable. So if you're lying there now, in soft pajamas, elastic waistband gently unjudging you, take a breath. You are not corseted. You are not balancing birds in your hair. Your knees are not tied to your shoes, and no one expects you to make lace eye contact in a powdered courtroom. You're already living in luxury. No petticoats, no bone stays, no hemline hierarchy. just you, a pillow, and the comforting knowledge that tonight, no one is coming to measure your waist before breakfast. Thank you for wandering through the centuries with me. If you're still awake, subscribe and tell me what country you're listening from. But if you're asleep, even better. Rest easy, fashion survivor, and may your dreams be stylish but breathable.